I'm Tim Combridge, technical content writer.
I'm Mariel Domingo, technical content writer.
And I'm Christine Marshall, technical content lead.
Welcome to the Picklist podcast from Salesforce Ben. Each week, we get together and talk about 3 topics that jumped out at us in the Salesforce ecosystem and sometimes technology as a whole. In this episode, we're talking about our favorite Summer 26 release features. Before we get started, I want to invite you all to subscribe to the Salesforce Ben newsletter. Our newsletter is the most direct way to hear about the latest articles, videos, and events coming to you from Salesforce Ben. So click on the link to subscribe. And with that, let's get started with our first topic, which is from Christine.
Thank you, Tim. Well, I want to talk about one of those updates that might not sound particularly huge, but actually makes a really big difference in your org once you start using it. So my topic today is all about consistent branding across reports and dashboards using brand color palettes. Now, I'll be honest, I've always had a really soft spot for themes and branding in Salesforce. It's one of those things that when it's done well, it just makes the whole system feel more cohesive, more intentional, less like a tool and more like your platform, which I've found is actually really, really good for user adoption. So what is actually new? Well, you can apply your organization's brand color palette directly to reports and dashboards. So all you have to do is set up a default theme in setup under themes and branding, and then that palette becomes reusable across reports and dashboards. So instead of manually tweaking colors each time or enjoying 50 shades of blue, as I know we all do, you define it once and then you're done. So I think this is a massive feature. I think it's going to be really, really useful. But we're starting to see this idea show up in other places as well, like Flow. We've talked about this before, where you now have more controls over colors and formatting. But when I saw the themes and branding for reports and dashboards, I see that there's now a little bit of tension because Flow is giving people a lot more creative freedom, which can actually work against the consistency if it's not governed properly. And that got me thinking, perhaps themes and branding needs to go a step further. And instead of just offering flexibility, you should be able to define rules at the org level. So what a warning message should look like, how emphasis should appear, what borders and highlights can be used. So essentially not just colors, but a full design system. Otherwise, I can imagine in future, can you think of how hideous and ugly flows and screen flows could become if on every screen your formatting colors are different, each warning message looks different. And I'm curious, do you think this flexibility is a good thing or does it need tighter control to really work?
Well, I'm probably the wrong person to ask because I also have a soft spot for customization and branding. But honestly, I think this is one of those features that seems, I'd say, cosmetic on the surface, but it actually matters quite a lot for adoption and user experience. But I do get what you mean because with this level of customization, your dashboards and reports can easily end up all looking slightly or even completely different, which can hurt more than it should have helped because the platform now feels disconnected and messy. So yeah, I actually think that having tighter control at the org level can be a good thing here. It still gives organizations the flexibility to define their own branding, but I'd say within a more consistent framework.
Nice. What about you, Tim?
Do you know, I can see pros and cons to this, right? It really brings me back to the whole, and especially talking about Flow like you have, with great power comes great responsibility. And I love how flexible the styling in Flow was made, and it was just the last release, wasn't it? Gee, time flies.
Spring.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it did irritate me that exactly like you said, everything had to be manually put in. There was no direct tying to themes and branding. There was no unification. And in my head, I'm totally on board with that. I think if you were to bring that sort of themes and branding to dashboards and all that, what if in the Flow, when you're sort of building out your screens, instead of being able to, or as well as being able to customize directly one by one, value by value, you could also go select the theme, which I know you can preview in a theme, but then could you then apply the theme as maybe this screen alone or this component alone should be themed, this one should just be standard Salesforce, something like that. That I would kind of like to see. But I'm totally on board with, unification of themes and branding. Themes and branding is great, but there's got to be a standard way to do it across the entire system,
Yeah, I was thinking if you had like a 10 screen flow, you almost want to be able to set the theme for the whole thing. Like this is how it's going to appear instead of in each screen, you have something slightly different. But I think overall, being able to adopt your theme and have your own branding is definitely a step forward. But our next topic, Tim, continuing with a little bit with the theme of flow, right?
It's continuing a little bit with the theme of flow and also with like the standardization of ways to do things, actually. So this is good timing. So as you know, shock, I am a big Salesforce Flow fan, and I've really enjoyed watching the agentic revolution begin to play out as well. So far, I think the feature that stood out to me most in the summer release is the ability to create and use agents directly from within Flow Builder. Now, I'm not saying this is going to be the biggest feature for everyone. In fact, I'm not even exactly sure who this feature is for or why it necessarily exists. I think it's interesting. It certainly feels quicker and a more streamlined way to be building an agent on the fly. And Salesforce, in their release notes, they sell it as like building an agent in a flow without having to change tools. So less clicks. That's great. But isn't an agent supposed to be something you think carefully about, not rush into? Especially given we're talking about the creation of the user record for the agent as well. You can use an existing user or you can create one directly from within Flow Builder. So I know other agentic tools use subagents. So I wonder if this is designed to be a way to build a similar functionality to that. And to be clear, the subagents I refer to in those other tools are different from Agentforce subagents, which just makes all of this even more confusing. Agentforce topics are now known as subagents, if you weren't aware, and behave very differently from other tools' subagents. The terminology confuses the hell out of me. What do you reckon? You got to stop me spiraling on this one.
I think you're right to call out the naming here. It is a bit of a mess, I feel. And I think for the audience, when people typically think of subagents, they think of smaller, specialized agents operating under a parent agent, each with a very clearly defined role. So that's like the standard definition of a subagent, and that's how other tools refer to subagents. Now, topics really don't line up with that model, and renaming topics as subagents, I think, is going to cause a lot of confusion because a topic is essentially a job to be done, an area of responsibility, not an agent in its own right. So the terminology here, I think, is going to cause some problems. On the flow side, I think that's also very interesting, and this to me feels like a shift towards the 2080 model that they keep talking about. So when we think about building agents, we have to think of it very differently to how we build other standard. So we heard a lot about this at TDX as well. They talked about the fact that when you're creating an agent, you're doing 20% upfront to get something working. So when you use something like vibe coding, for example, you give it some instructions and it spins something up really, really quickly. That's your 20%. And then the 80% is spent iterating, refining, and improving it over time. Now that it flips on its head our traditional development, right, which is normally 80% design and build. That's why we have months to get something out the door, even years to get Salesforce instances spun up and live. And then we have 20% typically iteration after go live where we refine things. But Salesforce is encouraging us to be more experimental with our agent design. It's a huge mindset shift. And I also think the other thing that's quite interesting to me is it's bringing agents into the flow of work. So if admins typically work in Flow, it's bringing agents in there instead of switching to a different tool, a bit like how they're bringing agents into places like Slack, which is what they describe as the user's flow of work. So I do get it, but I'm not particularly comfortable with this idea of 20%, 80% yet. That's a really difficult change. And I think you make a really solid point there about the access and the user as well. How do you make sure all of that is properly in place first?
Well said. Very well said. Mariel, what about you? What do you reckon?
Yeah, I think first off, Salesforce really needs to stop renaming things every 5 minutes because I swear half of the challenge with Agentforce right now is just keeping up with the terminology changes. Because you're right, between agents, sub-agents, Agentforce sub-agents, and topics, it can get very confusing quickly because, especially for admins who are trying to learn this on top of everything else that's happening in the platform, as well as their day-to-day jobs. So putting that aside, I actually think that this feature says a lot about where Salesforce wants Flow Builder to go. Because recently, Flow Orchestrator has been made more accessible to a lot of people, right? And it already feels like the central orchestrator for so much in Salesforce, like automations, even approvals, integrations, user interactions. So I guess it makes sense that agents are also being pulled into that same experience. And with that being said, I do agree with your hesitations a bit, because building an agent, that feels like something that should involve a bit more intentionality, I'd say, especially when there's governance and even user creation involved. So I almost wonder if a middle ground would have made more sense here, like just allowing admins to call or orchestrate existing agents from Flow without necessarily creating the agents in there directly. Because right now it does feel like Salesforce is trying to make agent creation feel as lightweight as building automation, and I'm not really fully convinced that those carry the same level of responsibility yet.
I agree 100%. That especially like what you were saying around, they're trying to make it seem sort of frictionless, but the weight of what you're doing is not a small thing. You know what I mean? It's like you don't just walk out on the street and go, you're hired, come in. You interview, you plan it out, you're trying to figure it, there's some thought that goes into it. The same thing goes with an agent. So I think really, really well said, Mariel. And speaking of Mariel, you're up next, actually. What did you have to bring to us today?
Yeah, so obviously we've had the object access summary for some time now, right? And I was happy when that came out because it shows you what specific permission sets or profiles grant which kind of access to the object that you're currently in an object manager. Now we've got a similar thing to that, but for fields this time. So if you've ever had to answer the question, hey, why does this person have access to this field? Then you know how painful it is to investigate that, because normally you'd end up jumping between various setup pages and, somehow you can still question if you've even sifted through all of them properly. I mean, it can get even more complicated for orgs that have grown massive over time, right? So with this update, Salesforce basically gives you a centralized view of field level security for a specific field. So now you can see in one place which specific profiles, permission sets, or permission set groups are granting visibility and edit access. The only catch right now is that this field access summary is read-only. So it helps you understand where the access is coming from, but you still need to make the actual changes elsewhere, like directly on the permission set or on the profile. But at least this time, you know exactly where to do that. And I mean, I think it's only a matter of time, because I wouldn't be surprised if Salesforce makes this field access summary editable in the next 2 releases, similar to what happened with the object access summary. So anyway, I'm curious if you guys think Salesforce eventually needs like a full centralized permissions management experience at this point.
Well said. Well said. There's a pattern emerging that I'm starting to realize is not limited to Flow, and that is making something really cool, but you can look but don't touch. You look at the data table that was in ScreenFlow. It was read-only. It was great. Everyone was like, I just want to be able to do things with it. And then he finally could. You know what I mean? There was I'm predicting the future a little bit here, but there was the Kanban, however you pronounce it, component for ScreenFlow. And in the next release, maybe, release after, we'll see, that will be editable, hopefully. So now, and as you said with the object access summary as well, and now field access summary going read-only and then edit down the track, that is a pattern that's emerging. But I think valuable, absolutely. Like, and the fact that this, it feels very late in the piece for this kind of thing, because, permissions are very, very important, especially now that we're sort of dealing with human and agentic permission access. So I don't know. I really think this is a good feature. I would love to see it editable. Centralizing permissions is just welcome addition. Sorry, Christine, what do you reckon?
Well, you read my mind, because I was also thinking about the new Flow Kanban, and I was thinking, yet again, this feels like it's better to ship something rather than nothing. Same as like the Kanban, like we were saying. Or maybe Salesforce are just adopting that 2080 approach to everything, not just agents. Like 20% to start and then 80% iteration in the next releases. I agree, it's not when. It's like it's not if, it's when it becomes editable. So I think it will become far more useful probably in the next release. I do also agree that we would benefit from a centralized permissions management experience. But here's a thought for you. If Salesforce is moving towards setup with Agentforce, perhaps it won't be needed or it won't be a priority, because in future, you might just ask an agent that can read all the permissions and things in a few seconds. It will tell you why something or someone has access, and it will make those changes for you. In that scenario, maybe we as admins don't get a centralized permissions management experience. We just have an agent that can zoom through the 1,000+ setup pages for us and make the changes. I don't know, just a theory. I'm future looking.
That is an interesting idea. It makes I would sort of counter that, or not counter, like agree with you in that, you know, agents are going to sort of do a lot more, especially in that security space. But in that case, shouldn't the all the different menus that we have to do things be a lot simpler and be, maybe that's why it's read only, because we won't be doing the touching. It will be the agents that do the work. That's it. Oh, there you go. Full circle.
First.
That's it. The strategy behind it. Oh, I love it. All right, that's a wrap. Thank you again for joining us for this episode of the Picklist podcast. Also, be sure to subscribe or follow us on your favorite podcast platform so that you never miss an episode. Catch you next time.